You were all in the dark. You couldn't see it. So, hello everybody. Thank you for joining our screening and conversation this evening. I'd like to say thank you to Marilyn and to Natalie for the invitation to come and do conversation today with Bani. When I received the invitation, my immediate response was actually what a great idea, because in fact we only met for the first time just yesterday, which is maybe a little bit of a surprise, because I think we've probably been working in the arts for probably a similar amount of time and have a lot of acquaintances in common, but somehow our paths never crossed until now. So I was familiar with much of your practice before, but this was also really a chance to sort of engage with some of your most recent things. So I'm very happy for the opportunity.
Thank you guys for this. It was your suggestion to get now.
So yeah, I mean, I'm happy that everybody sees the work afresh before the conversation. For me, this is the fourth time that I've watched it, and I think I have to say, for me, it's sort of I like very much the fact that it's a very watchable film, you know. So every time you see it, you sort of focus on different details, and you can there's something about it that you can watch it again and again. You know, this way that it starts off somehow like in the beginning sort of very, very sober, and then there is this kind of evolution in the film with this character, and by the end, you know, this sort of last scene that we see, you know, somehow it managed to, in a very succinct way, channel through a kind of simplicity, I think, this kind of balance of, in the end, humor, poetics, and also politics. And it's not easy, not an easy thing to pull off, I think, to have this kind of watchability and this kind of poignancy. And I think indeed it does, as a work in itself, embody some of the kind of themes that are there throughout your practice that Marilyn mentioned in her introduction. You know, we can put them on the table now, because I think they'll come up as we talk. This notion of displacement, of memory, of ideas of sort of public and private, also, and also about our relationship to nation, the idea of nation, and how some of these things possess a kind of violence, you know, a kind of psychological violence very often. But I think maybe it'd be quite good to start with, maybe to go back to the starting point. You know, it'd be great to hear a little bit about, you were telling it earlier on a little kind of story about that, one of the things that helped inspire the making of this work, and also to, because the work was commissioned.
Yeah.
It was commissioned by an organisation in the UK called Film and Video Umbrella, and if I understand correctly, it's also been gifted to a public institution in the UK, in the north of the UK, and of course it's, you know, I think moving image is somehow at the core of your work, but of course you do other things as well.
I mean, I think there's a lot of storytelling generally.
Yes, yeah. And of course it's I'm assuming, I'm making an assumption, but it seems to be a kind of a scripted film.
Yeah.
It's with an actor.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, the person is credited at the end as an actor, but I'd say he's very, very convincing.
He's a non-actor, but yeah, he's somebody's father. He's actually not a professional actor.
Okay. Because I was going to say he's very convincing as somebody who's like he's just arrived in a new place. But it'd be good to know if, first to hear a bit about the inspiration for this work, and also to say if this kind of, to what extent this kind of scripted approach to making a film is a kind of departure for you, or if it's really a kind of logical kind of evolution in your work.
Yeah, I think in a lot of my, mostly all of my films, I work with with storyboards, and they're scripted, and they're mostly all, none of their protagonists talk, so I've never had to write a screenplay, like a dialogue-based film, which is great, because I don't think I know how to do that, and that is kind of also a reason why the camera and one's attention goes towards everything else in the room. So the space and the objects and the gestures speak for themselves, and those are very detailed. It's my, as I call it, it's my first Berlin film. I moved to Berlin in 2011, and I made this in 2022. And all this period, I have been regularly going back to Pakistan. I'm from Karachi, and I make a lot of my films there, or I've been traveling back to India. Because it's just not easy for me to make. I can't be just plonked anywhere and respond to a place. So it has to develop a relationship with a city or a people or space. And so it's funny that it's not funny, but it's also kind of obvious that my first film that is about Berlin is about the life of an immigrant. And as somebody pointed out, that it was a lot of my films in Pakistan are always in public space. I kind of have a claim on the outside, on larger society, but the moment I make my film in Berlin, it's all indoors, and it's quiet, and it's a private space. And it's actually the first film I've made, which is about an interior, about a home, inside a home. And one of there are many things, and I can speak about sound later also, but one of the stories that really inspired me. A lot of this was coming from the fact that it was, while I was here, that a lot of the Syrian refugees came in 2015, and the conversation was primarily about integration, about how to help them get jobs, apartments, and live here. But I was always struck by how they'd actually left back homes and ancestral graves and lives and civilizations and languages, and so it was always about what has been left behind. That was not, there was such a forward thinking about how to move forward with these lives, but what about everything that they've left behind? And so one of the characters that a friend of mine interviewed, and she's a radio producer, was an old gentleman who had moved from Aleppo to Turkey to a refugee camp, and there he lost his wife, but he had 2 daughters, and he brought them with him, and he moved somewhere near Frankfurt. And his story was really poetic because he was a muezzin who performs the azan, the call to prayer, and it wasn't because he was that was his training. It's because he was an expert on maqam, which is Arabic classical music. And so a lot of his friends in Aleppo would ask him to come and perform the azan as a treat, because it was apparently so beautiful. So he would be the special azan muezzin. And so he leaves all of that behind, and I was really struck by, and then, that was a very central part of his life, was music and delivering a public, thing on the loudspeaker, where space really mattered. So I kept on thinking about him being alone and he would of course be connected to people on YouTube and phones and all of that. So he had a solution, but of course there was also a loss of place and profession and community and occupation. Mm-hmm. So that was one of the, there are many people, and I noticed a lot about the fact that Berlin is actually if you think about the fact that it's full of so many migrant lives, and you can be on the S-Bahn any given day and you hear people talking on the phone, and they might be talking to somebody in another country very often. I mean, a lot of these young Lieferando deliverers are constantly talking to their parents or their girlfriends in India or Pakistan. A lot of them are from South Asia. So I'm always interested in how all of these soundscapes come into what is Berlin, and then Berlin has many sounds existing in it at any given time. And so acoustic nature of the city also defines what the city is, not only what you see. So yeah, this gentleman's story was very inspiring for me, and my guy obviously is very different. He's not using the computer because I didn't want him to find such an easy solution. But yeah, that was one of the characters I was really drawn to.
Yeah. And in a way, you've kind of partially answered my next question, which probably even comes across as a slightly dumb question. But it's because obviously there's different ways to read this work. I think it could be about soundscapes. It could even be about invention. Maybe we'll come to that a bit later. But I suppose maybe I'd be interested to hear. And on one level, it's also a kind of portraiture, I think, and so maybe it's almost like what kind of portraiture is it? So to what extent for you does this person really represent a kind of displaced person, and maybe sort of to follow on from that, would you have a kind of particular way of understanding what the research might be for that kind of condition, or is it more coming from a personal space for you, or from your experience of living here, for example?
Yeah, I mean, I think I'm not really, I was very, very sure that it would always be an old man, and he would be alone, and I think there's something about, so younger people, and there may more, it's a very different nature of moving on in life and adapting to where you are, but there's a helplessness, and I think even the gentleman who is the actor, when I was trying to talk to him about the role and my interest in the story, and I said, what is it that you feel that has changed in your life since you've moved here? And he said, well, he's of course feels safer because he's not in Syria, he's in Germany, and day-to-day life is more secure. But he said, in Aleppo, I used to speak to at least 1,000 people a week, and so there's something about wanting a character who's had a long life behind them, and for that generation to have to leave home is, for me, and I can see with it, I think about my mother who's in Karachi, but the idea of having to leave at that age is particularly hard, and then something about why it isn't a woman. I feel that women are extremely resilient and make something of. There's something very befuddled and lost about her, and I think that I could get that in the choice to have it as an old man. But it really did come from, I think, the other experience that was a very cinematic experience that I had on the M41. Many people may know that. The night bus in Neukölln, I was on it one night, and there were just 2 or 3 people winter night, and there was a gentleman sitting and started, he was Kurdish, I think, and he started singing really loudly, he closed his eyes and he started singing in his most beautiful voice to himself, and he was he thought that there were just 2 or 3 people in the bus, but it became such a profound experience, and he kind of sung himself into a memory, into another place, and I was really, really, and I thought, oh my God, this is just a really intense experience. The fact that he's kind of created his own SoundCloud. So it was, I think, it was just the kind of people I had encountered that led me to make this film. And I'm still very interested in pursuing sound and the elsewhere, and how the elsewhere exists in our lives through sound.
Yeah.
So, and of course it's very, I can move on to talking about just the whole thing about, for me, why it's autobiographical, of course, also is that Karachi sounds like a lot of the footage that you see, which is not, just the smaller footage, is my own stuff that I've collected from my trips in Karachi. But every time I would come back to Berlin, because it's also about the double glazed windows was a very interesting thing for me, it's the architecture and how completely it blocks sound. And I was always struck by the silence. So I think it was difficult to make a film where there's so much silence.
Mm-hmm.
And yet I needed that people to stay with the silence, because it should be, I wanted it to be slightly haunting also, is where everyone feel it. Because that's how it is also, that you could actually love it. Now I love the silence, but it's also, it takes you a few days every time you go between cities to get used to such absolute silence.
Yeah.
Have I answered all your things? And is there
No, I think so. Because somehow it's, because I kind of think, I understand you as being a kind of politically conscious artist. But your way of doing that for your practice is really to bring it down to the personal and the individual. So I can see it somehow combining basically your experience, your personal experience, but also about what's happening in the world and how that impacts your environment, let's say.
Yeah, I think also displacement, I feel that it's always, there's a very gung-ho and like, oh, I made it and we moved ahead in life. And so that is generally the tendency, and especially when you, moving from a poorer country and you've made it out or whatever, but there's lots of things that are erased and quietened and hidden and forgotten in order to be happy and to exist. And those are the kind of little details that I feel. I always also feel that Berlin is a city where there's so much PTSD, because the history of Berlin itself. So so the generation that lived through World War II and old German ladies and everyone, there's such a history of trauma, and then the history of migration. And so you see conflict on streets, you see anger, you see whatever you see, and then you think that the acknowledgement of lives lived and that have had to be silenced, or for their own need to move on. Then the Syrians come in, and there's Ukrainians coming in, and there's so much trauma. There's my neighborhood, Neukölln, is one of the biggest Palestinian neighborhoods in Europe. So. So for me, this is also that the lives that are internal, that have to be, that are kind of closed up in order to survive. So it's not deeply tragic, but it is, and it is what forms us.
And I think maybe to come back to this sort of notion of memory, because there's a kind of particular approach you have in the film, which I think would be interesting to hear more, because of course it's really, it's a composed film, and then there are these kind of insertions in certain points.
Cell phone footage.
We do that more from cell phone, which sort of look like they almost represent sort of daydreams or memories that, so it'd be interesting to hear about that decision to sort of add these sort of little insertions in these certain moments.
Yeah, I think it's also because that was also a lot of that stuff is from my own cell phone footage, and so it was a way to bring my own video footage from Karachi into a fictionalized, completely constructed story. And the fact that a lot, and the phone, so it's not so evident immediately that this is cell phone footage, but in my head, the phone is actually when you read stories of people who've migrated or who've come in, whether through land or in whatever method they've employed to come here, the first thing that is their home is the phone with all their contacts and memories and contacts and photographs and videos and WhatsApp. Everything is that phone. And so for me, it was also somehow to get my little archive of my life, of the little object that travels between cities, between home in Berlin or between my two homes, that is Karachi and Berlin, is this gadget that accumulates the experiences of everywhere. And it's also the gadget that I use, of course, to communicate every day with people as well. So, yeah, and it puts a kind of documentary element into a fictionalized film, which is nice, so that it can project into a lot of different characters and people.
Indeed, it gives, I think, it makes it somehow like a different kind of artwork with these insertions, I think.
Yeah, it helped it. It was just, it was a very spontaneous decision, and then I removed some. Maybe it was too many in the beginning, but then we edited it down to the right amount.
Yeah, I think the bits that we're referring to, where there's one where there's like the street scene early on, and then there's the one a little bit later. There's 2 or 3 different clips combined when he's lying in the bed.
Yeah. I mean, there is the very important clip of the ceiling fan, and that's my biggest joke, is that I really miss having a ceiling fan. Not because it is that I'm warm, it's just that it creates a white noise that I've grown up with, and it has the right kind of movement of air in the room, and it's got a noise, and then I sleep really well with that. So, and I always say, and then my partner, God bless him, one of the first things he did when we met is he installed a ceiling fan for me. So that's the good thing about having a partner. But that is so particular. No one else would be able to relate to that. That kind of love for ceiling fans. And I always used to say, well, whenever I am to die, I should die under a ceiling fan. So when he installed the fan, I was like, well, you want me to die now? Or, but so this is just my generally leading into the idea of how material reality really forms your deep sense of belonging or contentment or familiarity. Yeah.
Well, that's when I was reading a kind of description of the work, there's a interesting notion that comes up, which is around acoustic displacement. It's a very interesting notion, I think, and I'd be interested. Because it is a way to talk about our relationship to place and the kind of environmental attributes that we find, in sounds, music, etc. I'd be interested to hear a bit about where that, because I'm also thinking, my first encounter with your work some years ago was with the work. It's called Sean Pipe Band plays the Star Spangled Banner, which I checked it out, and it's almost 20 years old.
Yes.
Which is really about sort of a brass pipe band in Pakistan, where you sort of collaborate with them and ask them to play the American national anthem, which you might also describe as being a kind of acoustic displacement, but maybe in a slightly different way to this film. So I get the sense maybe this idea has been something that's been there in a few of your works.
Yeah, I mean, I think that I do have a preoccupation with the mundane and banal things, material of everyday life that situates us in particular places. And so, like I was just saying to you earlier, that this one is about displacement and about the politics of migrant lives, but it's also something very important for me as an artist. Is that how, and which I was saying I'd speak about later, is that when I came to Berlin, it takes a while for all of these things to become embodied, and so for the material, for weather, for smells, till they become part of you, because these are all foreign. And so I've always loved saying that there's no such thing as a universal film, there's only a local film made well. So whether it's a love story, if it's a love story set in Karachi, it would have a certain set of material choices and seasons and times of day that mean something in that story, and it would be different set in Berlin. So one's physical environment helps you. Those are the different things that help you tell a story. And so when you take a person away from the land they know well or the geography they know well, then the tools and the grammar of that story is really displaced. And so that kind of exists. That's a very emotional thing. And so sound is a bit similar to smells. I mean, how smell can, the scent or the smell of something which may smell like something else can throw you off track completely, because it throws your memories back into places that it's so illogical. So it's so evocative. And with sound, it was always this. It was like me, when I used to live in the US for 6 years, and when I first arrived there, I'd get these home videos sent home from my sister. And the only thing that would make me really homesick was the really loud, aggressive, sound of crows. Which when I lived in Pakistan, it was like, oh my God, that's so noisy. But that was the only thing that would be so hard. I really miss it. Because it meant so much more than just the sound of crows. It meant a certain time of day, so you could feel the heat, you could feel everything just by that sound. So that's why the choice of missing sounds was a very important one. Is that how he's missing sounds in this film, but it's not as he's out to recreate them. He doesn't actually go recreate them completely. But there is an absence of sound, and he fills it with something else. But also, a couple of I've been thinking about sound a lot, and another work that I've done called Memorial to Lost Words is talking about 18, 19-year-old Indian soldiers who fought in the First World War for the British. There were more than 1 million boys and men who fought for the British. It's a history that's not recollected or told much. And I would go through their letters. This is around 2016, and a lot of these things were their melancholia. These letters that they would write home were about missing all of these things that I would miss in 2023 in Berlin. It was about food and songs and music and whatever, these kind of particular things. And that installation is also a sound installation that's about people singing songs, letters in Punjabi. So I think it's been carrying forth the idea of home and sound for a while.
Yes. And maybe to kind of follow on from that, because as I say, the kind of the evolution of the in the film is for me super interesting, because as I said, it starts off quite sober. We assume at the very beginning he's just arrived because of the suitcase, etc. But then after a while he seems to sort of start these little experiments with whatever is to hand, even with the lid of the kettle, sort of experimenting with the sounds that it makes, etc. And I think for me, on one level, indeed, you can sort of view this film with a kind of a political lens or a geopolitical lens. But I think for me, it's also interesting even to look at it even with a philosophical one. In fact, to really talk about your existence as an individual and to understand really what is meaningful in our existence somehow, and because we see that he's also a religious person, but at the same time it's clearly not enough for him. And then I think it says something about the kind of a very human thing to be creative somehow. It's very sort of these very individual, very quirky, idiosyncratic things that we all do. And so maybe like it, for me, there's also something there about creativity and kind of what the meaning that can bring to people.
I mean, it's not it's not the most, of course, it's an absurd film. Yeah, it's an absurd solution. None of it is logical so clearly that he just puts together. I mean, of course, somebody pointed out to me that he is clearly a Muslim man, and so when he's putting together things, the first reaction is he making a bomb, which is a very sad reading, but there is, of course, somebody said that, I mean, that for me is kind of an interesting thing. I didn't think of that, but, and how that kind of falls apart. But the person who's made the objects is actually a sound artist based in London called Ria Nakajima, and she's a sculptor and sound artist. And so it's the nature of her objects is also very important. She has a background kind of very inspired by Fluxus art. So this kind of the everyday and falling apart of constructions and putting together, cobbling together of things is very important in her practice. But in my character, I really wanted them to be doing this as well. And I've had it in a couple of different projects of mine where I really invest my characters with an artistic or creative agency. And that's really liberating because I want to remove, it's kind of, I want them to be the artists and not me. So to do the crazy things that I'm not doing. So I'm just telling the story, but my character is the artist. And the idea of how you can salvage things and emotionally and and also like in the face of difficulty or tough times, how does eccentricity kind of set in, where it doesn't, and you have, every city has its eccentrics who go around with their motorbikes with speakers and flags or whatever. They're committed to some purpose, and there's many of them in Berlin as well. And for me, he was one of those kind of people, where he's on his own mission, he's kind of in his own world, and he makes these objects that kind of, these are his companions actually. So they populate his apartment from being a silent one to they're his little fellow companions, and only when he has enough cacophony of sound around him does he feel comfortable enough to sing his song, because he's trying to sing it in a very silent space otherwise. So I think that kind of madness or eccentricity is extremely liberating in mine. I always think that a lot of eccentricity is actually, and eccentric people are truth tellers. They're the most unafraid to say it how it is. And so I'm kind of drawn to that, and the idea of not a logical solution, but a kind of whimsical resolution to a tough moment.
And he's doing it, of course, for himself.
For himself,
because it's in his domestic space, and he sort of constructs these kind of almost like automata, sort of automata band,
And it's interesting, so one thing that I should mention is that when this film was shown in England in the John Hansard Gallery, Film and Video Umbrella commissioned the writer Kamala Shamsi, who's a Pakistani writer living in London, who's I also know from Karachi, to write an afterword to this. So we just asked her to write in response to this film, and she chose to write a story of this character 10, 12, 15 years after the film. So it was a wonderful way, and it's here for people to take away. It's a little booklet. And that was also interesting, how this becomes, this is being spoken of in that book in retrospect, this moment. And there are other characters who enter, and it's about his displacement. She kind of names his displacement.
Right, yeah. And I think maybe even again, like, we just apply a slight kind of philosophical lens once again. And I think for me, the way I also read it is that, particularly reading it in times of difficulty, personal difficulty for a lot of people. There's something there also about sort of culture at large, and the power of culture, and sort of situations of cultural
despair in some ways, yeah, or
despair, but also in relation to sort of cultural practice, you know, artistic practice,
Yeah.
and situations of deprivation and cultural impoverishment,
yeah,
even.
yeah,
Because the way I read it is that it's almost like a kind of a statement on the importance of culture,
yes,
even.
yeah, and one's own kind of resurrecting it in some ways,
Yes.
resurrecting it for your own survival, and
Yeah.
So it is that whole idea of somebody singing themselves into a good place with a particular song. So that whole idea of your personal SoundCloud, and so you move around the city singing, and that you're elsewhere, that you belong. You survive through that gesture.
Yeah. Yeah. Also, when watching it on a kind of, I was also from the first view also sort of breaking it down into sort of constituent parts, because in a way it even reminds me a bit of some kinds of theatre. You know, in some kinds of, the idea of what was called poor theatre, where you have, a simple setup. We have a person who's seemingly alone here. You have a space, a domestic space with all the kind of basic amenities. A bed, to cook, to clean.
Yeah.
And then you have the sound as well. So for me that reminded me a bit of some kind of theatre.
Classic kind of setting up of the introduction of the character, and so that is the whole thing also, is that his early unfamiliarity and exploration of the space. It's a very simply constructed set of movements through his day, through the multiple few days of his early arrival.
Exactly, and it's not really about spoken words so much.
Yeah.
It's more really about even mannerisms and even emotion.
Yeah, the guy himself, that was very good, that he himself was somebody who had had the experience of having migrated 5 years before, but it was also his age and his body he was an old man, so he moved in the way that I would have wanted my character to move, just naturally, and he couldn't speak German or English, so his son was translating for us. But I think he was really got drawn into it, and after a while he was sitting around alone in this apartment while we were shooting, it did feel that it was really about the actor's life, and he kind of fit into that space very well.
Yeah.
Of course we found the apartment, everything was done with a lot of care, everything from the carpet to the fans and the bed and the particular form of the blanket and what's the food, and these are the kind of things that I am also really interested in, because I have a training in visual art and not in filmmaking, so I really care about the significance of objects and which ones they are. So there's a lot of time spent thinking about everything that is, all the objects that are in the... Yeah. I could make films that are just about objects. They might not be that interesting, but I get very attached to the performative potential. I'm interested in the performative potential of these things.
Yeah, indeed. And I suppose...
For instance, the clock, the Azan clock, is like the most well-known object in Muslim diaspora. And I remember it from my Chicago days. I've never had one, but I remember that I would go with all these cab drivers, most of them were Pakistanis in Chicago, and they would be chatting away. And one guy said, Alhamdulillah, it is so incredible because in my house, every time the bell rings, it is the azan or something like that. And so I'm transported every day. You know, I go back, I'm in Pakistan, I step out the door, I'm in Chicago. So he had set up this entire like triggering, like things like bells and sensors where things would sound out into a space that he felt was home. And it was all these cheap Chinese objects which create these sounds. So that always stayed with me is how this little azan, the mosque clock, becomes the mosque, the prayer, the ritual, the community, everything. Yeah. And so for instance, on the sound, that object had always stayed with me, and I knew that I wanted to have a film where that would be in it, and included in.
Yeah.
So that's also the kind of way
the
story is formed, is by the objects.
And maybe to ask something, you sort of touched on it a little bit earlier, and maybe it's probably not even the kind of a question that I might typically ask, but when I watched it, I was also reminded a bit of some work of an artist who might be considered a kind of contemporary of yours, which is Rosalind Nashashibi, British artist.
Yes. I don't know her work very well, but does she do fictional films? Or?
They're not so fictional actually, but they are. I'm thinking of work that are about men in certain situations.
Okay.
So I'm thinking of, for example, one film is about people that work on a cargo ship. And how they find themselves in men find themselves in certain situations that are on one level kind of very masculine, but at the same time sort of emasculating.
Yeah.
And I'd be interested to know to what extent for you, with a bit of knowledge of some of your other works, to what extent it's also in a way a reflection on the kind of the male subject also.
Yeah, I think there are quite a few, and I think I've done the work which is The Man Who Talked Until He Disappeared, which is a set of, that is about activists in Pakistan who were picked up by the state, and I made paintings with them while listening to their video interviews, and their paintings disappeared. So it's a series of interviews. And then there's, I never intended for it, but it has happened that I've worked a lot with men, and somehow also because I've really been interested in the state being male and representing, so power is also represented in terms of masculinity and politics. And so Death at a 30-degree angle, which is about a politician who wants to make a statue of himself, is also about a man. But in that case, so it's kind of slightly comical, vulnerable, silly, stupid character. So there's something that can be still mended. I haven't given up on them, but they display strange qualities, which as a woman is slightly absurd for me. Is the idea of so one of my recent works is, which I did after COVID, it's called The Reassuring Hand Gestures of Big Men, Small Men, All Men. And it is, I collected hand gestures of politicians making speeches. So it was just an archive of the raised finger, the wave, the victory sign, and there's 69 photographs, and they're all photographed from the computer. So it's kind of also looking at male performance and performance of politics. And then there are more vulnerable people who I've known, some of the characters. There's another set of a project I did, which is a set of flick books. It's called The Speechwriter, and it's about an old retired man. And I think that these people kind of may reflect my father. And this particular story was related to my father's friend. But it's about a speechwriter who used to write, it's about becoming irrelevant as you become older, or political moments shifting. And in that project, it's all about eccentricity. He's retired, there's no one to write speeches for, no one considers him important anymore. So you see him every day putting on his suit, sitting in his study, setting up a microphone, everything, and then he takes out a folder with things in it. And then it cuts to the outside of his house where there are big megaphones and speakers attached on outside. And he's just reading out all his old speeches to no one. So again, he's an eccentric. He's a neighborhood eccentric. And no one is there to listen to him anymore, so he just reads out his old speeches to no one. And that has this self-created sense of relevance.
Yeah.
So it keeps on happening.
Yeah.
That there is people struggling with importance or struggling with their internal lives, and and they keep on coming up. But they're all old men. There are no young people.
No, but there is a kind of vulnerability to the
to this guy. Of course, it's like melancholic.
How are we doing?
8:30.
Okay.
So should we ask?
Yeah, we can, maybe it's a good moment to sort of open it up to some questions from you or
Unless yours.
reflections. Yeah. There's one question over here. Yeah.
I was thinking about how do you reflect on needing your own voice, needing to hear your own voice or using your own voice? Because I was thinking about him, it's, he creates the white noise, but there is, as you said, he doesn't speak, but then he creates it, and then he activates himself into singing.
Yes.
And you talked about also the Kurdish man, and I think there comes like a certain importance with it, because you can create white noise, but you cannot really, you can turn the radio on maybe, but he doesn't do that. And also I was thinking, even if he turned the radio on, there might be like German on there, so it doesn't create this feeling of familiarity and being home. So you kind of like feel the necessity to create it your own, because this is the language that you're familiar with, and no one can give it to you because there is no one. So you're kind of like activating yourself into it.
Yeah. I mean, I think that is so for me it's very distinct that when he's sitting in the bathroom trying to sing alone to himself, and he's sounding, it's like an interesting sounding way of singing, like that is his. And it's surrounded by complete silence. And these, so I think what was important for these being objects was that they were also objects and not just sound. The fact that they're actually kinetic objects moving around brings them closer to being characters and alive in some ways. So I think in that way it wasn't just about background sound, it was some kind of populating and activating a very sterile atmosphere. And that all of that enables his personal ability to sing. It's the background that is created for him to sing as much as he wants. And the cardboard tubes that he has is actually because the sound you hear was recorded from inside the cardboard tubes, because it accentuates sound in a different way. So it wasn't just a visual prop, it was that we recorded the sound for that moment from inside there. So it was about how he's it's all kind of in his head, and he creates this. It's almost like a filter through which everything is being absorbed and funneled into his ears.
Yeah. Are there any other questions from anybody? Yes?
I was wondering if you could talk a little bit more about, because you collaborated with an artist to create those sound objects. I was wondering if you could just talk a little bit more about collaboratively how those came about and kind of what you were seeking to do with them.
I mean, it was really fortuitous that I wanted somebody to make analog sound objects, and I wanted somebody who loves making them. It's not that I knew or was interested, but so I actually found another German guy who was in Berlin, but the sensibility was very different. And then Ria is somebody I was referenced. And I asked her, and I didn't know her at all. I just said, "Listen, this is crazy. I'm living in Berlin," and I wrote to her, and she wrote, "I would love for you. This is kind of the story I'm looking at, and I need sound objects." And And she was really happy to do it. And she was very excited about the idea that her sound objects, Ria's work usually it's incredibly beautiful, it's installation based, you walk into galleries and they're very tiny, insignificant looking things and very ephemeral material. So she works a lot with air and throwing things she performs and with foil. And so her own, the way she shows her work is very minimal. And the fact that she would get all of these objects and put them into a set was very interesting for her. So she researched it. I said, these are the kind of sounds that he's thinking of. And one of the sources that I've used for sound, which is a lovely a Berlin person has created it, it's called Radio Apparat. And it's actually like a Google map, and you can go and if you're wanting to collect field sound recordings, field recordings, you can go all over the world, and there's sound recordings that have been located and uploaded onto this website. So I used that. So it was kind of also another way to look at an open source document or platform where I just collected sounds from elsewhere. So I sent her a whole bunch of sounds which was almost coming from an imagined geography. It was the sea, and so I thought, oh, this guy could be there. And it was of course a lot about Karachi, but it could be any Mediterranean coastal city. So I sent her that, and then she thought about these, and she came back to me with these objects. So she was sitting on the set, making them, these objects, with us, and then showing him how to put them together. So she was very much part of the team. And I think that it was also, it's interesting because at some point the question is also asked that isn't this Ria's work? In some ways, she's so central to this. And her objects are so central, and it is her sensibility as well of how things sound and the materials. And I think, yeah, it is a very valid thing that could it have been just, a Bani Abid and Kojima work together, but except that she was commissioned to do it, and she took out a day from a very busy performance schedule to come and make these for me. So I gave her sounds a narrative, a very particular narrative, which her own work would never have. It would be very much more open. But it was incredible to work with someone who really loved and knew what they were doing.
Are there any other questions?
You didn't initiate the objects, the sculptures with the objects, like the initial, like the milk frother, or
Yeah.
you chose those objects?
No, they're all hers.
Oh, all hers.
So we decided, I said I found her because I wanted somebody to use, I wanted my character to use everyday home things to make sounds.
Because that's randomness.
Huh?
Like that milk frother and that little
Yeah.
water bottle, like that randomness just like ties everything together. And
Yeah.
it just makes it so real actually.
Yeah, sorry. Because it's plastic bottles, and they're really ubiquitous. Everyone has them with recycled
And it's a
ammo.
Turkish one, so like it's very like that just makes it very believable.
Yeah. I think that was exactly what I had intended, is that they have to be everyday objects. I mean, I did think that, okay, this guy what will he be doing with the milk frother? He's not making cappuccino. So it's not fully credible, because he doesn't actually make cappuccino for himself. But she wanted to use it because that's part of her set of tools that she uses for. So I said, that's fine. So it's not fully, but I was really interested in, like for instance, the bags. Or just the plastic bags are enough to create a certain kind of sound. But what was more fascinating was that she's like a bit younger than me, that they're two women and they're like really interested in the possibility of sound, and I had not seen her work in order to script her work into it. I didn't know about it. But to find somebody who's doing exactly what I wanted my artist to do was really, incredible.
But I think that milk frother, I didn't see it as like, oh, does he make cappuccinos every day? But I found it like as like a little detail of displacement, because that milk frother is crooked.
Yeah.
Obviously, it's been used
and
or
it's
maybe
been handed
not
down,
being used right now. And he's trying to settle in and
use whatever he's finding.
Whatever he
Yeah.
finds.
Yeah.
That's
That
what-
is it, and sometimes it don't make sense to him. So the electric toothbrush
Exactly.
is more interesting to him for the idea of the fact that it can circulate something, that it
Mhm.
moves,
Mhm.
and it's battery operated. So
Mhm.
that is what, or the sound that it makes,
Mhm.
rather than, for him an electric toothbrush is not as important as
Mhm.
the acoustic potential of it. So it is about his lack of knowledge of things, or
Mhm.
he's not subservient to an object, to use it in the way that it's expected to be used. And that's also this whole idea to transform what is around you into what you need
Mhm.
to be happy.
Mhm.
Yeah.
Are there any other questions, observations?
I have a sort of observation.
Yeah.
I love the iteration and that kind of creative agency of problem solving as he's both making place for himself while building this other place that
Mhm.
he's missing, and that's something really human and beautiful, and it creates a really interesting tension between being more there and being more there.
Yeah.
No question, just
Yeah, no, that is, I think, in fact, I just have a wonderful bit from a story. Is it, Claudia, is it Emine Çevki Öztürk? Is it her name, Emine?
Yes.
It's a Turkish-German writer, and she's got lots of awards. She is a dramaturg, and she's a theatre director as well, I think. And she's written this beautiful, it's about belonging in multiple places, and she's written a beautiful short story called Hof im Spiegel, and Der Hof im Spiegel, I'm getting stuck with Der T, Der Hof im Spiegel. And it's about her having a conversation with her mother in her living room, and there's a big old mirror in her Altbau, and it's kind of leaning forward, and in that mirror she can see downstairs in the Hof where there's a group of nuns who live in the ground floor, and there's some activity happening there. And she's relaxing and talking to her mother in Istanbul and telling her what the nuns are doing while seeing the reflection in the mirror. And the mother is commenting on what the nuns are doing as well. So it's a three-way, and the nuns are not involved in this, but it's about the mirror being reflecting the current space in this incredible way, and a conversation with another woman, and the multiple, so that creates a different geography between Istanbul, between her apartment, and between this group of people living in her building. So it is a very particular geography for that moment that this conversation and that reflection of an activity lasts, the sort of magical confluence of these three things. So this is also that, it's a kind of magical confluence of a few things that creates an elsewhere which is not here or there.
Did you have a question, Marilyn?
I was wondering about narrative actually, because when you started saying something about Bani's ability, or in this film particularly, that it's easy to watch, or there's a particular tension in it. And I was thinking, can you tell us a little bit more about your process, like how you start a film and how you think about narrative and the importance of that?
Well, I mean, not all my films are, I don't have funding for all my films. Sometimes I just shoot them on my phone, or even if they're fictional, it's all really varied. I don't have one stand. The only thing is I do fiction most frequently. And fiction is easy because I don't have any actors doing any dialogue. So anything can become fiction for me. It's just about it, but it's not, I just bring things together. And so this one was very influenced by the fact that I had a team working with me, and Svenja, who's my production assistant, is sitting right here, and it was really it was really a new kind of experience, and I had done it once before in a film that I'd shot, or twice before actually, but it's not something I do every time. So every time I work with a film crew, I have to relearn it, and it was. Again, it was just like we had scenes set, and Sanya was very, very particular about, she was walking around saying, this is what we're going to shoot now, and it was very neat and tidy, and I think it's the film almost existed completely edited already in my head. So the editor's job was really minimal actually. It was just choosing which take worked better, because actually there are not that many scenes. So it's very clear. You go down he goes up and down you just need enough time to show that a few days have passed. You have to see, whether there are enough evening scenes, so that time is passing. And then the fun part is the running around on an alley finding the objects. Because that is where the delicious nature of how the film is going to look is being determined. So the set designer, Andrea, who is on here, it was nice to work with her as well, to discuss, so that the story comes together in this way. So I was getting lots of photographs of what exactly the blanket should look like. And so these are not accidental choices, they're all very thought out about the light and the things. And that's, for me, at a very personal level, that is the fun of making an image. But it may not even be something that's important for an audience. But because I don't make very long films, and they're kind of short projects, I can dive deep into these details. And that brings the story and bring the narrative together.
I have a slightly different question, which is more about your the medium, the film medium.
Yeah.
Because I know some things about artistic practice in artists in Pakistan, albeit more in Lahore, and not so much Karachi. But Karachi is, it's kind of known for a certain kind of pop art. The art there has, of course, a long history, but in terms of contemporary art, it's maybe not inaccurate also to say that you're probably the first generation that really went international, correct? And probably also like the first generation that really worked with this medium.
Video.
Also.
Yeah.
So it'd be interesting to hear a bit how you maybe even came to the medium in the
Karachi pop is an interesting thing. Also, it's called that, but it's it is really central to my practice. But it's the 90s in Karachi, and it's just a very, very brief breakdown of what was happening culturally and politically. We had a dictatorship till '89. That was Zilberman, who was kind of the dictator in place to enable the Cold War in Afghanistan. And when that was over, he was over, and so it was a moment of democracy and a female prime minister. So everything opened up suddenly, and the opening up, so from very private lives in studios and a lot of painting and modern art inspired painting and sculpture, suddenly the street and everything was, the outdoor was up for analysis and observation. And I was doing painting at that time from and nothing like what I do now. But that pop art, as it's called, it was about looking at the material of the city. So the language of the city, the tones, and literally the graffiti on the streets, and what were people thinking. It was the most cross-class kind of urban public engagement between artists and genders, and looking at really what was the commerce of the city, what was being sold, what was being produced, working collaboratively with painters who worked on trucks, or with metal artists, or different kinds of people. So anyway, it was a very formative period, led by a group of an older generation of artists who were teachers at that point. And so that kind of really made me leave painting completely and move on to having more of an anthropological engagement with art making, where thinking about place a lot more than ever. So that's when the studio couldn't be easily transferable anywhere. You had to be in a particular city, and if you didn't, you had to respond to it in order to make something. And the decision to make video was interesting, because I realized at some point that I'd also grown up in South Asia. I would say it's safe to say that the kind of highly developed literary and imagination is incredibly developed. So the kind of, I grew up in a home where there was a lot of literature, and my mother and both my parents would have an incredibly sophisticated literary imagination. So abstraction and metaphor, all of these things were very impressive. So I learned a lot from that. But when it came to single images and painting and stuff, weren't that interested, or they had a very flat understanding of that. So I would always think about the fact of how narrative and storytelling is somehow very highly developed in this media. And these are very oral cultures, and there's a lot of storytelling, everything, there's poetry everywhere. So that's what kind of made me, and of course I was studying in Chicago, so Zilberman, who is like a brilliant Palestinian filmmaker, I solely attribute my filmmaking to having watched his film, Chronicle of a Disappearance, but then Divine Intervention. These are two films of his, where he talks about conflict and all its absurdity and ugliness, but in a way that you're laughing and you're uncomfortable, and he's brilliant, he lives in New York. So Chicago and all my exposure to film there was very formative for my decision to start working with video and time-based narrative. And also I'd say that, so the two films that when I was trying to, making this film, the two filmmakers, I would tell Stephen Board, who's the director of Film and Video Umbrella, I said, I'm kind of like my character is kind of part like Chantal Ackermann's Jean Zilberman, and part of Jacques Tati's characters, Monsieur Hulot. It's a bit between both those characters. He's like his negotiating sound and playtime. So it was about that, and it couldn't be more different from each other and also far away from me. But that was Chantal Ackermann's, that Jean Zilberman is a very, very inspiring film. So those are the kind of references that I had in my head for this film. But I think that the stories work well, and so I'm sort of okay with a lot of my work is based very much storytelling, because I think in South Asia there's a propensity to engage with them.
Absolutely, no, it's interesting you see the relationship more from the literary tradition than the fine art painting.
Yes, so I think that is somehow truer and more embedded. And very evolved. So I think a lot more people respond to that than to fine art or to contemporary objects and paintings.
Okay. I wonder if that's a good moment to wrap up.
Thank you. Thanks a lot.
Thank you, Bani. Thanks everybody.